Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Greg Borowski, Executive Editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and it's my job mostly to welcome you and thank you tonight and then get out of the way. So I'm going to start with the welcomes and thank yous. So first, thank you to the reporters who put this panel together and did such great work on the project that is associated with it, our panelists for joining us, those who organized our event, our hosts here at the Oneida Hotel, but especially thank you for those who are coming and have joined us tonight and who are watching on our various streams. When I started out as a reporter many years ago, the story was the end of the process, right? We did all the interviewing, we dropped the story, and we hoped that people would read it and it would, make some sort of difference in the world. Today in journalism, often the story, or stories in this case, are the start of the process. And it's an opportunity to really create a two-way dialogue, to ask questions, to engage the community around the journalism that Caitlin and Maddie and Frank did so well with this project. I was looking today as I was jotting down some notes at the headline for the first story on the package, which was, at least online, Great Lakes Tribes' knowledge of nature could be key to navigating climate change, and then will enough people listen? I think the two key words in there are knowledge, that there are things that we know, that all of us collectively know, that the tribes and others know, and then listen. Are people going to listen and hear that message and the words? And tonight is really part of the listening, but I would add in a word that it's a share opportunity too. So for you guys in the audience, I think the charge is to be active participants tonight, to listen and then to share what you've heard so that more people can get the message and the word, and that's the way that journalism can continue in a much different way than it used to when the story was the end of the process. So that's my opportunity to begin the process tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin Luby, one of our reporters.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Caitlin Luby. I'm the Great Lakes reporter at the Journal Sentinel. Through Report for America. I've been reporting on this beat since June 2022, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity here to share knowledge and to learn from our expert panelists on this topic, and just have a deeper conversation about how can Indigenous knowledge help mitigate climate change. So first, before we begin, we'd like to thank a bunch of people that made this series and also this community event possible. So first, I want to give a deep thanks to our panelists, who you're going to hear a lot more from in a little bit. We have Al Geddix, Ziel Ponick, Chris Borden, and Leah Zeitze. I also want to thank our sources on this series and their just openness to share their deep knowledge with us on this series and allow us to tell these stories. Funding for this series, as well as this community event, was provided by the Poynter Institute and the Joyce Foundation. We also want to thank the Oneida Hotel for hosting, and we also want to thank Jim Rosendick and Brett Christofferson, part of the USA Today Network Wisconsin, for live streaming the event today. I also want to say that it's a privilege to have this conversation on the Oneida Reservation. We want to thank them for providing us space to continue to have conversations about traditional ecological knowledge, climate change, and land stewardship. And we also want to acknowledge that reporting for our series occurred throughout what is now known as Wisconsin, the lands of 9 Native nations and home to 3 Native nations that were forcibly relocated to Wisconsin from what is now New York. We acknowledge the history of genocide, forced cessation of lands, and active effort to erase their culture. Finally, we want to acknowledge that for generations, Native nations have and continue to be left out, marginalized, and stereotyped in the media. We are committed to learning, growing, and ensuring that their knowledges and perspectives are included authentically in our stories. So along with myself, there was 2 other reporters on this project, which you're going to also hear a little bit more from in a little bit. First, we have Frank Vassvilis. He's covered Indigenous issues for Gannett, Wisconsin since June 2020 and has been based at the Journal Sentinel since June 2023. Frank's roots on his mother's side are Yaqui, the indigenous people of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. There's also Madeline Heim, who has covered the Mississippi River Basin for the Journal Sentinel since May 2022 through Report for America. She's previously covered health and science issues for the Appleton Post-Crescent and was the lead Gannett, Wisconsin reporter on the COVID pandemic. Now, before we get into our panel discussion, we just wanted to dive into a little bit deeper about how this series happened and some topics that we discussed. So when Frank, Madeline, and I were putting our heads together about thinking about what kinds of stories we wanted to tell, I thought of something that Whitney Gravel, the president of the Bay Mills Indian community, told me when I was interviewing her for another story. Something that she talked to me about was how tribal treaty rights really help protect the environment for everyone and for generations to come. So we wanted to explore whether the government was upholding treaty rights and how traditional ecological knowledge can help us mitigate the effects of climate change. And so we did this by specifically looking at the land, air, and water. Altogether, we were able to talk to tribal leaders, citizens, and natural resource personnel from 10 different tribes across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. We also spoke with the EPA, scientists, Indigenous and environmental groups, attorneys, and Great Lakes regional organizations. So I just wanted to open a little bit talking about what traditional ecological knowledge is and talk a little bit about tribal treaty rights. So traditional ecological knowledge is place-based, meaning it's really tied to the land, and it draws on knowledge passed down for generations. Indigenous communities have been living harmoniously with the land for thousands of years, practicing good land stewardship, and trying to share that message with others. It prioritizes the human connection with the land and gratitude for natural resources. It also is about solving problems before they arise instead of waiting for them to happen. And something that I really appreciated in my conversation with Bazil, who you're gonna hear a little bit more from in a little bit, something that he said to me is that traditional ecological knowledge, it's often stereotyped as folklore, but really it's been through thousands of years of experimentation and trial and error. It's a science in its own right, he said. Now, when talking about environmental issues and climate change, it's important to recognize that any issues with the land, air, and water are not confined to man-made boundaries, which is one of the many reasons why it's important to talk about tribal treaty rights. So Wisconsin is home to 12 Native nations, 11 of which that are federally recognized. 6 of these tribes are Ojibwe, who came to the Great Lakes region from the East Coast more than 1,000 years ago. They were in search of a place to settle where prophecy told them that they would find the food that grows on water, or manumin, or wild rice. The Ojibwe were forced to cede tens of millions of acres to the US government in a series of 4 treaties in 1836, 1837, 1842, and 1854 to create what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Ojibwe tribes were put on reservations and granted the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the off-reservation lands that they ceded. And a lot of conversations that we had were about whether tribal treaty rights were being upheld and what do these treaty rights actually mean. One thing that really struck me in my conversation with Whitney Gravel is that she told me that treaty rights are kind of like peeling an onion. There's lots of different layers to them. So the treaty right to fish is not just about the physical act of casting a line or putting out a net, but it's about the environment that that fish lives in. There needs to be clean water, not only where the fish lives, but also in all the waters that flow into that water, as well as the land surrounding it. We heard frequently from our sources that they do not feel like treaty rights are being upheld. And this is especially true and problematic when it comes to being proactive about climate change. We also heard that there was a lot of room to grow when it comes to non-tribal entities working with tribes. We see this at the federal level, the state level, and we're going to hear a lot more about this from our panel. So now I'm going to turn it over to the other reporters so they can talk a little bit about what they learned during their reporting process. First, we're going to start with Madeline Heim.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really, really glad to see all of you. Really honored to be in this room with all our wonderful panelists. So as Caitlin said, I'm Madeline Heim, and I primarily cover environmental issues in the Mississippi River Basin for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. From time to time, I also write about agriculture through an environmental lens. So looking at both the negative effects that can have on our natural resources, such as greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient runoff that can pollute the waterways, and disturbance of soil. But I also spend a lot of time interrogating solutions to those things and the farmers that are doing incredible work trying to mitigate those effects, which can result in healthy soil, clean water, and carbon storage, among other things. So for this series, I was really interested in learning more about indigenous farmers and tribal agriculture. According to the latest U.S. Census of Agriculture, which just came out last week, just 191 of Wisconsin's 100,000 plus farmers identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. So I was really honored to spend time with some of them during my reporting for this project. I got to witness the amazing work of Ojibwe, the Oneida Nation's white corn co-op. I spoke with the manager of the Forest County Potawatomi's farm and interviewed a college senior who's a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation and has already had a big impact shaping how her tribe thinks about sustainable agriculture. One big theme emerged from that. There's a gulf between what we commonly think of with American farming, monocropping, maximizing yield, a go big or get out mentality, and what tribal agriculture seeks to do, which is to deepen the relationship between food, land, and people. Everyone I spoke with underscored that relationship. Leah, who you'll hear from more later, and I talked about how the corn that she grows is written into the tribe's cultural identity and how they think of the corn as a relative that has chosen to enter into a relationship with humans, where humans take care of the corn and the corn in turn takes care of them. And having that relationship and respect drives the motivation to care for the land that the corn grows on. One thing I followed in my reporting was a research project that the co-op has been part of for the last several years to use cover crops on an experimental field among their cornfields. And cover crops hold the soil in place and hold on to nutrients so they don't run off in the water. And Leah just let me know before this that it was so successful this year that they will be switching all of their fields to have that cover crop mix next season. So it's very cool. But yeah, all this work is becoming more urgent in the face of climate change. As I'm sure I don't have to remind any of you, Wisconsin was experiencing a huge drought last summer, which has an effect on our food and our food systems. So I think we need these agricultural practices more than ever to bolster the land so that we can help our food survive and ultimately help us survive. So I'm looking forward to diving a little deeper into this during the panel, but for now I will pass it to Frank to share some of his insights. And oh, you got the pointer. I don't have to struggle with it myself.
Good evening. Yes, I'm not looking to talk too long here, but I traveled all over the state for this series, visiting, different reservations, different tribal leaders, including Red Cliff, Bed River, Mole Lake. So in the upper right-hand corner, that's Chairman Bob Van Zyl of the Mole Lake reservation, and he's dropping some wild rice into he's offering a blessing actually before going out to harvest wild rice. And he told me something interesting that was out there. Well, for the series, he's talking about brown spot fungus disease that's killing the wild rice. And they're trying to figure it out and how they can save the wild rice. but also something interesting. He told me a story from 100 years ago, when logging was big in northern Wisconsin. They used to run the logs, through the water systems, and it would pass through Mole Lake and effectively killing the wild rice. So they appealed to the Indian agent there, and to the federal government, and they were eventually fought, for their right to reroute those logs, and save the wild rice on their reservation. And then fast forward to the 70s, Mole Lake, the Rice Lake, was being threatened by the Crandon mines, which we'll hear more about later. It wasn't reported too much about in our series, but Al would talk more about that, so we'll hear more from him later. But I just thought it was very super relevant to bring up here tonight. Just in case everyone's here read the series. I would just want to talk about new content tonight. So that's the case of the two different tribes, the Mole Lake and Potawatomi, just coming together and joining forces with non-tribal people, with environmentalists, with scientists, and just really fighting sulfide mining that would eventually they thought would kill the rice. So they eventually won, and they just celebrated their 20th anniversary of the purchase of the Crandon mines. So that's one thing, and then that's in the upper left corner. That's another Van Zyl. She was out there with our Giovanni Hernandez. He visited the Mole Lake Reservation and took some nice photographs, and so it was a great celebration. Al was there as well. And then we, moving on to Lac du Flambeau, the rights to protect the we all heard about the walleye spearing, so I mentioned that in the series as well, and then the Potawatomi and their right to air, the right to challenge companies in the clean air. So great. So looking forward to tonight. Thank you.
So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and move on to our panel discussion. So with us tonight, we have Bazil Ponek. He's a consultant with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and a member of the Red Cliff Band. We also have Leah Zeitze. She's the founder of Ohe Lagu, and she's also a member of the Oneida Nation. We have Chris Borden. He's a tribal liaison for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And then we have Al Geddix, who's the executive secretary for the Wisconsin Resources Protection Council. So first, I'd just like to take a couple minutes and have each of the panelists introduce themselves a little bit more and talk about their work within this space. Al, do you want to get us started off, please?
Sure, but I'd like to preface my remarks by letting people know that this is the first anniversary of my vocal cord surgery for cancer, which was a successful operation, but I'm still recovering my voice from that operation, so that's why it's a little it may sound a little strained. If at any point you can't hear me, please raise your hand and I will adjust my level of voice. My initial initiation into the business of consulting with tribes about natural resources, particularly mining operations, occurred in 1976 when I was invited by a group called Americans for Indian Opportunity, which was a venture of LaDonna Harris in Oklahoma, a native Cherokee, and her husband Fred Harris, Senator Fred Harris, who was interested in applying the lessons of resource nationalism in the third world, where the oil companies, or the oil producing countries and the copper producing countries renegotiated essentially the benefits of their resource extraction with multinational oil and mining corporations. And the idea of Americans for Indian Opportunity was to take that model of asserting political power over one's own natural resources and apply it to Indian reservations who, in their mind, were seen as developing nations with lots of resources, but with a history of colonial extraction of the resources, which did not benefit the tribes and, in fact, contributed to the environmental and the economic degradation of the tribes. And so they were trying to provide a new model of dialogue and negotiation between powerful corporate actors and tribal governments that had jurisdiction over natural resources. So in this conference at Racine, Wisconsin, 1976, I met members of the Mole Lake Tribal Council who had just been appraised of the discovery by Exxon Minerals Corporation, one of the largest corporations in the world, of one of the 10 largest zinc copper deposits just a mile upstream from the reservation and from the discharge into the tribe's wild rice lake. And of course, the whole history of Mole Lake was that they were not recognized as a reservation until the 1930s. Up until that point, they were squatters on the land in the Forest County and Forest and Langley County area. And so the location of the Mole Lake Reservation was precisely designated as the stronghold of the tribe for one of the last remaining wild rice lakes in Wisconsin. And so any discharge from Exxon's proposed mine a mile upstream from the reservation would essentially destroy the wild rice on the reservation. And so the members of the tribal council asked me to assist them in constructing a plan to oppose mining development in the situation of Exxon and the state of Wisconsin, both of whom were fully confident that a mine next to the reservation was inevitable. And I'll talk more about how that evolved later on. But that was my initial learning experience with the issue of tribal control resources and the fight to maintain the cultural and economic integrity of reservations. And after 28 years of opposing the mine project, the tribe was triumphant in not only driving the mining company off the reservation, but negotiating a sellout or a mineral rights transfer of the property from the mining corporations to the combined Forest County, Potawatomi, and Mole Lake tribe, which meant not only that they had defeated the mine, but they had also established the permanent preservation of the area as a cultural resource area, which under the jurisdiction of the Mole Lake and Potawatomi tribes would never be developed as another mining project. And that was a world historical achievement. No other examples that we know of exist where not only have Native people defeated mining projects, but they have established a permanent way of conserving the area for future generations. And I'll talk again more about that later on. But after Mole Lake, there were other mining projects. In fact, northern Wisconsin was one of the targets of about a dozen large multinational corporations beginning in the 1970s and continuing up to the present day. After Mole Lake, actually simultaneous with Mole Lake's opposition to the Exxon mine, I was also involved with the Lakudere tribe, who were concerned about the impact of the proposed Flambeau mine next to the Flambeau River in Rusk County in the city of Ladysmith on the cultural and tribal resources that were guaranteed by the treaties for the Lakudere tribe, as well as all the Ojibwe tribes in the Midwest. And we fought that mine for several years And again, I'll talk about some of the outcomes of that. But basically, the mine went ahead despite the opposition of the local community and the Lakudere tribe. And that mine continues to pollute the Flambeau River today, just as we predicted that it would if it went ahead. After Flambeau, there was the Pinocchio Hills mine next to the Bad River Reservation at the headwaters of the Bad River that flows into the Bad River Tribe's Wild Rice Lake, or wild rice beds on the shore of Lake Superior. And that struggle lasted 5 years, from 2015 until about 2019. And so you can see the knowledge that was accumulated during the Crandon mine conflict that had to resist Exxon over 28 years. And then the next major mine battle that was seen as inevitable as a victory for the mining company turned out to be another defeat of the mining company in 2019 when Gogebic and I pulled out of the project, again with the same kind of coalition of native and non-native peoples that resisted the mining project and established, at least for the time being, the security of the Bad River Tribe's wild rice beds on the shore of Lake Superior. Right now, I'm involved with the Menominee tribe and their opposition to another proposed copper, or is actually zinc and gold sulfide mine next to the Menominee River on the Michigan-Wisconsin border, and that has been going on for 20 years. And the corporation that originally proposed the project has declared bankruptcy. They left the project, but they sold it to another corporation, and so now we're involved in opposing another corporation trying to exploit a mineral deposit less than 150 feet from the Menominee River, which flows into Lake Michigan, and so any contamination, which is inevitable with this type of mining, that would go into the Menominee River would affect eventually its discharge into Green Bay and also into Lake Michigan. And so these kinds of battles have been going on for the past 50 years. But what is exciting about the work that I'm involved in over these decades is that we have achieved several victories which have demonstrated the power of native knowledge, native organization, and native determination in alliance with their white neighbors to confront and eventually overcome the power of these corporations.
I guess I'll try to follow that up. No, it's an honor to be up here with you, Al, and Leah, and Chris, and thanks to all the folks for inviting us to be here, and to those who are in attendance today. I'll introduce myself in the Ojibwe language. Bujun Indinwe Maganadug, Minwa Nij Bamatasijig. Hello, all of my relatives and friends. Minogija Gabo and Dagu, Gama Squabi Kang and Dunjaba, Megazi and Dodem. Niwi Wanish Tagos. I'm going to humbly interrupt and speak. My name is Bazil Panik. I come from the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. Professionally, I have like a day job, a night job, and a weekend job. So I'm a consultant for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. We're putting together the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report. I also work for University of Wisconsin-Platteville, trying to return cultural fire and indigenous fire regimes back on the landscape. And then I run my own consulting company called Good Sky Guidance, and working with a bunch of different folks on integrating indigenous knowledges into their operations and collaborative environmental projects. So those are my professional positions, but I guess a little bit about my background and how I come into this work is I feel really honored and privileged, not in the economic sense, but privileged in my upbringing with both my mom and my dad and my grandpa, and just so many people around me that were really inspiring in their work with indigenous knowledge and in the environment. I was lucky enough that my mom and dad brought us around to ceremonies and to cultural events. There was a lot of elders that I learned from when I was pretty young. I think I'll tell a story from my youth. Is just I think listening is powerful, so I'm glad you all are here to listen to us as people with experience. Listening is really powerful, and there was a moment where I was brought to a ceremony, and after the ceremony was over, we met up with one of the elders from that ceremony, and he, we listened to him. We were doing kind of like not an interview, but he was just telling us stories, and he actually gave me some songs that I would end up using later in life, and I was like, dang, this is going on forever, like such a long time. Like I want to go home and play video games or something, but my mom and dad kept reminding me, like you will look back on this someday, and you'll use this knowledge someday, and they were right, I guess. So I look back on those times and the elders and just the knowledge keepers that we have here today that are so inspiring and carry so much knowledge, and we need to leverage that in our ways that we attack or mitigate climate change, whatever terminology you want to use. So I think we really need to honor those folks, and you're so inspirational, and it drives me to ask myself, how am I going to become an honorable ancestor for future generations? Since I'm trying to honor my ancestors, and how can I make sure that future generations honor me as well, and that I leave a good life for them. So I think Misa you, that's it for now. Igwage, thank you.
Segulis wagway kutka honini yungyat segway huene lia zaizi ni yungyat so sunage wagwapo ni magit the load oniota aga ni magayu hunjot galugawani ni magani. So hello everybody, my English name is Leah Zaizi, my Oneida name is Hukahuni, and I am here from the Wolf Clan, from this place, the place of the ducks, and the Oneida people are the land and the earth that I come from. And my mom is also here, and my dad is also here, and my partner, so thank you guys for being here. My story is kind of interwoven with your guys' story and Chris's story. I also grew up really involved in the community, and I'm very, very grateful for that. My mom was an activist with the Exxon line, so I'm surprised you guys have recognized each other. Everybody recognizes my mom. But, we grew up going to protests and going to actions against the Exxon mine, and I used to get teased in school. They would like make a little circle around me with little signs that said, "Stop the Exxon mine." So I'm pretty proud of that. I think that's a cool thing to have experienced, and just having that instilled in me from a very young age of how to speak up and how to take care of our relatives and how to take care of each other. And then that continued through my schooling, and then after schooling, coming back home to be a co-founder. I wouldn't say I'm the founder of Ohilagu, because you can't found a cooperative by yourself. So I wouldn't call myself that. But we started growing corn because that's one of our responsibilities as Haudenosaunee people, and we failed really bad that first year growing corn. And so we actually gathered up a whole bunch of Haudenosaunee corn growers here in this building at one of the food sovereignty summits, and we asked them what their issues with growing corn were, and we all had a lot of the same issues. So that's what got us thinking we should get together and we should be growing corn the old way, not in these little 10 by 10 plots by ourselves in our backyard. That's a really European model for a garden, for a farm. Our model is to grow together and take care of the land together. So that's what got us started growing as a co-op. And so I just did the numbers, and we've grown over 40,000 pounds of corn since 2015. Which is crazy because we harvest it all by hand. So, but I'm really honored to be here with such awesome wisdom. I'm really thankful for all you guys for coming out here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, and thank you. Now I'll go.
Evening. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Chris Borden. I work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. For those of you unfamiliar, you can think of us as the conservation branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm reminded by Leah and Bazile to say something about myself. I do not have tribal affiliation. I almost have the opposite of tribal affiliation. My father was in the Army and in broadcasting, so just about every time the oven needed cleaning, we just packed everything up into the Mayflower and just moved on. Then we didn't have to worry about cleaning the oven. My first experience with understanding the value of tribal ecological knowledge is I did have a chance mid-career to serve 2 years in the Peace Corps in the Republic of Panama. I worked with farmers, Embera and Chacoy farmers, and I had all of my experience as a USDA employee, and I was going to be the ingeniero agronomo allá to show everybody how to improve their crops and their conservation on their land. And I was somehow or another blessed with some mentors there that kind of took me to the side and told me told me to listen, and told me to watch how things work, because they had been at it for a while. They had an it's Panama, it's 10 feet of rain a year. They had 2 varieties of corn that they grew. One that was harvested during the wet season, and the capullo, the end of it, was very tight, so that you could harvest it and you could store it without it picking up extra moisture. And so that was the first crop harvested during the rainy season. They had a second one that yielded better, but it had an open end to the ear. Yes, thanks, Leah. And that did just fine, because in Panama in the dry season, around Christmas time, it just quits raining, just like that. So my ideas about bringing in improved corn varieties, they were really clear to me about listening and operating within the framework of what they had all developed down there for the past thousands of years. So that was my first. That's a little bit about myself. I want to open by thanking all the tribal leadership and the tribal producers and staff who made this remarkable Milwaukee Journal Sentinel series possible. And thanks to Caitlin and Maddie and Frank for bringing this to life and for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's been my honor over the past, my office is in Medford, Wisconsin, and it's on land that was shared by the Potawatomi people and the Ojibwe. It's been my honor over the past 20 years to work with tribal nations and tribal organizations to make natural resource conservation service programs more meaningful on tribal nations. For those of you not familiar with our business model, Congress finds about $5 billion worth of taxpayer money every year in support of private lands and tribal land conservation. Our business model is basically we provide technical and engineering services to landowners and land managers to help them implement conservation practices on their lands, and importantly to reimburse a percentage of the cost of installing that conservation practice on the land. Congress does that and Congress has been increasing our funding because there's a recognition that land and water conservation is beneficial to the general public, not just the entity that's applying that conservation practice on their land. As a federal agency, like all federal agencies, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has federal Indian trust responsibilities under treaties and statutes to protect and maintain the lands, resources, and traditional use areas of Native Americans. This is treaties, which are even more important than statutes, like the Farm As a USDA agency, the NRCS is committed to government-to-government consultation and coordination with federally recognized tribal nations, the goal of which is that tribal perspectives on the social, cultural, economic, and ecological aspects of agriculture, as well as tribal food and natural resources priorities and goals are heard and fully considered in the decision-making processes of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We are, as an agency, we are late to meeting these responsibilities, and we acknowledge that. And for reasons we might get into as part of our conversation tonight. We deeply appreciate the willingness of tribal leadership and tribal subject matter experts to share their knowledge with us to get us to a better place. And we've learned that our programs are strengthened when they're informed by tribal knowledge. When we think about tribal ecological knowledge, a lot of times we're thinking about land stewardship practices refined by tribal nations over thousands of years. That can help address ecological challenges we face today. So we're very appreciative of the willingness of tribal nations and tribal organizations like the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Intertribal Agriculture Council for sharing their knowledge with us in order to be able to utilize our programs to encourage the restoration of wild rice and to promulgate the benefits of intercropping techniques like the Three Sisters Gardens. In addition to conservation practices, tribal knowledge, as an agency, tribal knowledge teaches us in the NRCS the potential of landscape scale conservation carefully planned out for the benefit of future generations. A few years ago, I was out in the field with Pat Pelkey. At the time, he was the director of the Oneida Nation Environmental Safety and Health Division. And we were on a pretty good hill that they'd done a prairie restoration on. And he was pointing out the conservation practices that tribal nations had implemented as a part of their really well-considered long-term land and water stewardship plan. And it struck me that as far as we could see, and it was a pretty good hill, as far as we could see changes that had been made to improve the land and water for future generations. The cropland was managed to build itself up and not erode away. The cattle and bison were grazing in ways that improved the soil and protected water quality and provided a place for other wild beings on the landscape. The streams that had been straightened over the history were restored to their original meandering paths. Drained wetlands had been returned to their roles as refuges for wildlife and protectors of water quality. And the riparian areas have been reforested to shade streams that were now home of brook trout that had been gone for a very long time. It was a very humbling experience having a chance to talk with Pat Pelkey, who I consider one of my mentors. Just seeing that on the landscape was remarkable. The other piece of tribal knowledge that helps us as a federal agency get on a better path to meet our tribal trust responsibilities is the willingness of tribal leaders to help us understand tribal authorities and tribal treaty rights and push us to respect and act on those authorities and treaty rights. In the Great Lakes region, this has helped the NRCS understand how we could help with wild rice restoration and improved walleye rearing ponds in the ceded territories. In the western United States, tribal nations are teaching us how we can assist in their bison restoration efforts on co-managed federal lands. It's remarkable the depth of our ignorance on things. We really very much appreciate the patience and goodwill that has been shown to us. Treaties, statutes, court decisions, and the United States Constitution make it clear that learning from tribal nations and acting on that knowledge is required to meet our tribal trust responsibilities. Time is too short in my brief remarks to adequately express our appreciation to tribal leaders, tribal staff, and tribal organizations for their sustained commitment to helping the NRCS and other federal agencies get on a better path to meeting our tribal trust responsibilities. I very much look forward to learning here today from the folks, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. So we're now going to move on to our question and answer portion. We're going to start out by the reporters, Maddie, Frank, and I are going to ask the panelists a couple of questions. And then when the time comes, we'll turn it over to the audience. And at that time, we'll let you know when that is. You can line up at the microphone and then introduce yourself and ask your question. And then also, you can fill out a note card. If you're unable to come up to the microphone, we'll make sure those are on hand, and you can write your name and your question, and we can have those be asked as well. So the first question I wanted to ask, and this can be for whomever on the panel, I was wondering, how can traditional ecological knowledge and Western science be blended to answer some of our most pressing challenges with environmental issues and climate change?
That's a great question. Yeah, well, I think it's not necessarily that TK and Western science should be blended, because as I mentioned, that TK is a science in its own right. I think both of these things can work together and be braided together to find some answers on what we need to do and how to care for our environment. TK and our knowledge holders, they have a lot of answers. We've been here for a little bit, and TK is actually older than Western science, or at least how we understand Western science today. So we might have a thing or two to offer when it comes to climate change, adaptation, mitigation. I'll bring up a story where I was at a workshop, and a lot of Western scientists were trying to consider where to do some tree ring studies on where cultural fire had existed in a certain landscape and how frequent it had been, or like, where do we start? This is like thousands and thousands of acres to survey. Like, where do we direct our project? And there was a community member that was pretty quiet, sitting at the table, and he just kind of perked up, and all the Western or the non-native people were just like talking, and feeling like just being kind of noisy, honestly. The community member was just like listening and just sitting back, and then just kind of like perked up and was like, well, my grandma said that she used to burn in this area, and like pointed to the map that was on the table. It's like, oh, maybe we should start there then. The Western scientists like need to listen, and TK has a lot of answers, and our knowledge keepers hold a lot of information, and I'm excited to see like a project directed at that area that a tribal member brought up, and so that's how like TK and Western science can be braided together or work together. As Chris was mentioning, that we are teaching Western scientists a lot of the time and how to live sustainably with the land. So I think that's how I see them being braided together.
Thanks for that. Did you want to add something, Leah? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I agree with that. And I think that beyond being a science, I think of TEK as being part of a worldview. And some of the most fundamental aspects of that worldview could be the most helpful to Western science. So something that Robin Kimmerer said that I really liked was that the Western science question will ask, how can we do it? And the TEK question is, should we do it? Where do we draw the line on what is something we should be doing? Taking into account all of those relatives that we have. Another aspect is to always be giving thanks. And I think that's an aspect that we try to get across, but it's really hard to talk about the fundamental nature of giving thanks and Thanksgiving in a worldview that is so just the taking of things and expecting to be able to take instead of honorably harvesting and asking if it's the right time to harvest, and being in that communication with our relatives so that oh, maybe there's not enough here for me to harvest this year, so I'm not gonna harvest this part this year. And then taking the time to go through that thought process. Or like for us, we plant extra rows of corn for the animals, knowing that the animals are gonna come to our field because we turned their habitat into our cornfield. And so instead of building a fence around our cornfield, we plant some extra acres for them and we expect them to take it. So there's a level of relationship and thanking and being humble in our role and our place in the web that I think could really inform Western science beyond just the nuts and bolts of individual pieces of knowledge that are really easy to extract. And I think that's why people are really hesitant sometimes when you kind of put the question out there like, okay, share your TEK with us. Well, what are you gonna do with it? And you know, that could, in the wrong hands, that could be really dangerous. Even our seeds, we have to be careful with our seeds because there's so much biopiracy of the genetic information in the seeds. We wouldn't do that to our corn relatives. We wouldn't pull our corn relative completely apart and make a zombie corn relative because it grows more corn. That's something that we would never do. So asking the why and should we is an important part of the TEK conversation.
Just really quickly, as an employee of a federal agency, as a bureaucrat in general, we need to be very careful when it comes to taking our guidance from tribal nations and tribal subject matter experts to find out when it's appropriate for us to have conversations as to how that knowledge might be shared and promulgated, because we have an unfortunate history in the United States of taking from tribal nations, and so we really need to be cautious. We have a great set of partners that can keep us on the right path on that. But I wanted to make just a general comment because I've attended. Again, I don't have tribal affiliation. I don't have a great background on things, but tribal nations, tribal natural resources folks will remind me many times that that's not the only thing in their tool chest. And a lot of what we've learned when it comes to the use of cutting edge technology to be able to develop conservation solutions have come from tribal natural resources departments with their use of unmanned aerial vehicles and remote control mowers to be able to solve those problems. And so it's really humbling how much we do learn from tribal nations to get things to a better place.
That's actually a perfect segue for my next question. So then how can folks make sure these conversations are not extractive? And what's the balance between using traditional knowledge to inform environmental work and not laying too much claim to it?
Yeah, we need to approach this with a humble attitude. We need to approach it with sideboards that if we don't have enough of the right people telling us that we're on the right path, that we can assume we're on the wrong path on things. So we're just very cautious, but we're very interested. I think just federal agencies in general are really looking for opportunities to be in the right room, not just when it comes to the discussions of tribal ecological knowledge, but also learning how to behave in an appropriate fashion, a culturally appropriate fashion when we're talking about this, and making certain that we're ultimately humble and we don't express pride of anything that's sourced from tribal knowledge. And we're not so great at that sometimes, so we need to remember humility and maintain humility.
The tribal perspective has been historically devalued and disregarded by development and regulatory agencies, and this was clearly the case when I became involved with the Mole Lake, Sikaga, and Chippewa and their battle with Exxon. One of the first things that they asked of myself and my fellow graduate students was to put together a multidisciplinary research team to evaluate the social, economic, and environmental impact of the proposed Crandon mine on the Mole Lake community. And in order to effectively do that with sufficient resources, we applied, or actually the tribe, Mole Lake tribe, applied to the Economic Development Administration, Federal Economic Development Administration, which does grants for these kinds of studies. And the first thing we ran into was that the federal agency told the tribe which consulting firm they could hire and which consulting firm they could not hire. And the consulting firm that I and my graduate students in other disciplines, in geography and botany and hydrology, anthropology, sociology, economics, that expertise was essentially disregarded and made ineligible for a federal grant. And it wasn't, if it wasn't for the determination of the Mole Lake Tribal Council in saying that either we choose our own consultant or we don't do the study, and you look like you have violated your trust responsibility to provide for the responsible oversight of the resources that would be affected by any potential mine development. And so the whole notion that information was politicized from the very beginning on behalf of the existing power structure, which uniformly approved projects over the objections of tribal governments and tribal populations. One of the first things we had to do was establish the precedent that this is not going to be the way that these studies will be conducted in this particular project.
Thanks for that. Frank, did you have?
Oh,
Feel
I
free to
just, something that's just springing to mind right now is that another aspect of this extraction of knowledge that's, I think people need to be particularly careful about is that some information really is not meant for everyone. And there's a reason for that, and to trust that reason. And that if you put yourself into the shoes of an Indigenous person and you think about this question, how do we use your knowledge to manage your land that we will not give back to you? So I think the land acknowledgement is really nice, and the next step is the land back. So there's ways to contribute to that, and I encourage everyone here to contribute to those kinds of initiatives and to make those kinds of commitments, because we don't need words anymore, we need actions.
Okay, I'm done. Thanks for that. Frank.
Yeah, so this is mostly just for Al here. Just want to ask more about the Crandon mines. So I know you've mentioned this, but how and why exactly did you get involved with the Crandon mine, the fight against the Crandon mines? How were you invited, and what's the whole background of that?
Right. Before I became involved with the Mole Lake tribe, and for that matter with Americans for Indian Opportunity, I was the research coordinator for a group in Madison called the Community Action on Latin America, which was designed in the aftermath of the Vietnam War debacle to provide education and support for liberation movements in Latin America, including the self-determination of governments like the Democratic Socialist Government of Chile to assert its national sovereignty over its own copper resources. And in 1970, the people of Chile elected a democratic socialist government whose first act was to nationalize the foreign-owned copper companies that were exploiting both the resources and the people of Chile, and return sovereignty over its own resources to the people of Chile. And because of that daring venture, they became the targets of a systematic attempt by the United States government and the foreign corporations, or actually the American corporations, Anaconda and Kennecott Copper Corporation, to overthrow the democratically elected government of Chile, which they did in 1973, and institute a brutal military dictatorship which returned control of the mining of copper to foreign corporations like Exxon, the same corporation that was interested in exploiting the Crandon mine deposit. And I was involved in looking at why it was that all these countries that depended on the extraction of one or two primary commodities, like copper in Chile, why those resources did not benefit the people of those communities. And that's why I was recruited by the Americans for Indian Opportunity to talk about how the experience of these third world countries that had resources were relevant to the future of decision making in tribal communities. And so I was invited to that conference in Racine, Wisconsin in 1976 that brought together tribal government leaders from resource-rich nations like the Navajo and the Hopi with the coal resources, or the Northern Cheyenne with their coal resources, along with potential new resource colonies like the Mole Lake situation, where Exxon was prepared to extract about 55 million tons of copper and zinc from the Mole Lake, from a mile upstream from the Mole Lake Reservation, that would dramatically affect their wild rice. And of course, the discharges from that mine would eventually not only destroy the wild rice of the Mole Lake tribe, but also contaminate the ecosystem downstream on the Wolf River, from which the company would discharge its waste material, and affect the Menominee tribe, which depended upon the Wolf River for their lifeblood. And so I was asked by the two members of the tribal council to help them construct a plan to protect the wild rice resources of the tribe from this proposed development. And one of the first things I did was try to get some support from what I assumed would be the natural allies of the tribe in the environmental organizations in the state of Wisconsin, and particularly in Madison, the large ones. But what I found was that when I went to those organizations and asked them to support the Mole Lake tribe in opposing the Crandon Mine project, they told me that this project was inevitable. That if you have a corporation like Exxon with all the financial and legal and political expertise that they have, combined with the governor of Wisconsin, and it didn't make any difference whether we had Democratic or Republican governors, they were all in favor of the project, and they all assumed, along with Exxon, that this project was inevitable because of who the political players were. And that sort of mindset infected the thinking of mainstream environmental organizations, who said the best we can do is provide some kind of political support for you in the legislature, where we'll get regulations that would limit the damage from the mining operation on the resources of the tribe. And of course, from the point of view of the Mole Lake tribe, this was not a question of mitigating or reducing the damage. It was preventing the damage in the first place. But from the point of view of the environmental community, who depended upon well-endowed foundations for their support, they did not want to alienate the political establishment of Madison and the national fundraising community by siding with a tribe which was, from their point of view, going to lose this battle because of who they were up against. And so the smallest, the most economically deprived tribe in the state of Wisconsin at that time, and still is, the Mole Lake Reservation. It's the only tribe that does not have a 12,000 mile square reservation, like all the other Ojibwe tribes. They have an 1,800-acre reservation, and Exxon was threatening the existence of the tribe by its proposed mine project. And so when I got involved, I not only had to think about who the enemy was as far as the mining company, I had to think of who the enemy was in terms of environmental organizations, which essentially validated the thinking of these corporations who viewed the Mole Lake tribe as an obstacle in the way of development. And this, of course, is nothing more than a resurgence of manifest destiny. You know, the racist idea from the 19th century that Native peoples were destined to be swept aside by the progress of Western civilization and economic development. And Mole Lake stood alone in the state of Wisconsin against the governor, against the regulatory agencies, against the powerful corporations, and said, this will not happen here.
Wow. So, as a non-tribal person, and with your graduate students, what was it like for you guys to work with the tribe? Were there any initial misunderstandings? How did you make it work?
Actually, the misunderstandings were not confined to the Madison environmental elite. There were also, non-native tribal planners in the bureaucracy of Mole Lake as well as the federal government, which looked upon the initiative of this group that I formed called COAC Research, which was the organization, the research organization that eventually won the contract from the Economic Development Administration to do this environmental assessment of the mine project on the community. And the suspicion was, in fact, it was well-grounded suspicion that a lot of the do-good liberal organizations that come to the assistance of tribes do not always have the best interests or respect the wishes of the tribe when they conduct their research and publish their findings and consult with their funders. And so it was that initial suspicion that we had to overcome. And of course, this was also in the context, and this was 1976, and so as the opposition to the project developed over time, the opposition of the Mole Lake tribe coincided with the entire state controversy over Ojibwe treaty rights, particularly the spearfishing controversy, where many white communities in northern Wisconsin viewed tribal treaty rights as a threat to the fishery and a threat to the economy of the North Woods. And so we had that level of suspicion and hostility to deal with while we were trying to, provide assistance to the tribe in their evaluation of how best to oppose a mining plan which had pretty much universal support among powerful elites in Madison and in the corporate world. And keep in mind that Exxon, which was the project developer, was not a mining corporation. Exxon was and still is an oil corporation. They were diversifying into the base metals area because of all the super profits they made off the oil crisis of the 1970s. They had to put their capital into some other productive investment, and so one of the investment alternatives they chose was to develop the Grandin mine and also to take over the copper mines in Chile after the military government, aided by the United States government, overthrew the Salvador Allende government, and Exxon became the beneficiary of the return of copper mines to foreign mining interests. So that was sort of the political landscape during much of the Grandin mine controversy. And so one of the things that we figured out to break through not only the hostility against a tribe asserting its sovereign authority over their own resources, but also asserting the legitimacy and the power of treaty rights in the context of an opposition movement that wanted to eliminate Ojibwe treaty rights. People like Walt Brezett from the Red Cliff Reservation put together this idea of a witness for nonviolence, which was something that was developed again in Latin America, where young college students would go down to Central America during the Central American Wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala, and they would accompany the residents of those communities who were being attacked by U.S.-supported Contra rebels in Nicaragua or other kinds of death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala. And Walt Brezett said, you don't have to go down to Central America to provide support for Native communities. You can do it right here in your own backyard. You can go to northern Wisconsin, and you can put yourselves in between the Ojibwe spearfishers and the treaty supporters and the members of the Ojibwe tribes, and document the hostility and the violence of the anti-treaty movement that were abridging the guaranteed rights of the Lake Superior Ojibwe. And that became the basis for the Midwest Treaty Network, which then became the basis for what became known as the Wolf Watershed Educational Project. The Wolf being the river where the discharge from the mine would be dumped into, and the idea of the Wolf Watershed Educational Project was to bring together the tribes, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, the Mole Lake, Oneida, Stockbridge, Munsee, all in one Indian environmental coalition that worked together, that held meetings on reservations and in border towns around the reservations, and essentially said that the way to defeat this mining project is to go back to the basics: grassroots organizing, raising the educational level of the community, doing fundraising events, and participating in the regulatory process, not with the idea of being of dramatically altering the outcome of the proceeding, but of demonstrating the widespread support of those local communities, both tribal and non-tribal, in the context of a Wisconsin treaty controversy where Native and non-Native communities were being systematically divided against each other over the misunderstandings about Native people taking too much of the fishery, when in fact the main threat to the fishery was not Ojibwe harvesting of walleye, but mining companies dumping acidic wastes into the Wolf River and all the tributaries of the wild rice lakes all over northern Wisconsin that would destroy the basis for the entire Ojibwe Lake Superior culture. So that was the insight that developed from the necessity to bring together a powerful grassroots force that could not only oppose but make clear that the dominant viewpoint was changing about what the role of Native people were, especially Native people that had treaty rights that could be asserted in the ceded territory, and not only treaty rights over hunting, fishing, gathering, but also treaty rights that eventually affected their Mole Lake's ability to enact its own water quality regulations under the Clean Water Act, where tribes that had water resources that would be affected by off-reservation mining development, those tribes that had that sovereign authority could exercise their regulatory authority, just like the state of Wisconsin could exercise its regulatory authority over waters of the state. The federal government recognized under the Clean Water Act that Mole Lake and other tribes in the state of Wisconsin had the ability to set their own water quality regulations that could protect the sensitive wild rice downstream from the proposed mining, and therefore pose another major legal and federal hurdle that was not available to the non-Indian community. And so the non-Indian community got an education about the power of treaties and the power of the tribes to assert not only control over their own reservation resources, but in so doing, protect the resources of the entire community downstream from the mine.
So this is my last question here, and anyone can follow up after Al. But I just wanted to ask, so the Mole Lake and Potawatomi, they were the only ones who had the will to stop the mine and purchase the mine. So from that takeaway, how are tribes in a unique position to leverage their sovereignty and argue in courts and with the federal government? How are they able to leverage that to challenge resource extraction industry that can threaten the environment? So and feel free, anyone else can follow up. So
one of the lessons of the Mole Lake and Forest County Potawatomi purchase of the mineral rights was, first of all, that it wasn't just Mole Lake and Potawatomi, it was the combined power of the 5 tribes, Forest County Potawatomi, Mole Lake, Menominee, Stockbridge, Muncie, and Oneida, all united against the mining project and putting the resources, much of those resources coming from newly formed revenue sources on the reservations from casinos that could be used to finance technical and legal assistance for the tribes to press their case for federal recognition of their water and clean air regulatory authority. So that was a major breakthrough that became critical in the next major fight between the Bad River tribe and Gogibic-Taconite, which wanted to develop the largest iron mine, open pit iron mine in the world at the headwaters of the Bad River, that would destroy the Bad River tribe's wild rice, as well as contaminate Lake Superior with mine waste discharges. And because of the model that was developed by the Crandon mine fight, the same Indian and Environmental Alliance that defeated Exxon, the world's largest mining and oil corporation, was then used to defeat the world's, actually the country's largest coal mining company. The Gogibic-Taconite company had no experience in iron mining whatsoever. They were a coal company from West Virginia and the Central Appalachian region, which saw the demand for iron ore in the 2000s as a lucrative investment opportunity, which did not require them to consult the authority of the Bad River tribe, which also had water quality authority similar to that of Mole Lake. And because of the ability of the Bad River tribe in alliance with their neighbors in the surrounding communities in Ashland and Bayfield and other communities that depended upon Lake Superior for their drinking water and their water resource economy, they were able to defeat the Gogibic-Taconite company and preserve the shoreline for the sustainable resources of the Ojibwe community. But both Mole Lake and the Bad River community were at the forefront of a worldwide insurgency, worldwide resistance of Native peoples all around the world to assert greater control over the mine process. And in 2007, the United Nations passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which recognized the principle of free, prior, informed consent. Free, prior, informed consent, which meant that you can't have corporations going into communities, ignoring the wishes of the local community, and expect that those projects will be permitted or be economically successful. And so what Mole Lake and Bad River, as well as to some extent Ladysmith, which even though it was a defeat in terms of the battle over the mine, it was a victory in terms of the persistence of the community in demonstrating that the dismissal of the concerns of the local community would result in the contamination of the resources. And that is exactly what is happening on the Flambeau River in central Wisconsin. So free, prior, informed consent became the rallying cry for a worldwide indigenous resistance to extractive resource operations that had its origins in the state of Wisconsin. Number two, after Crandon, the mining industry began to talk about what they termed as a social license to operate. This was not a term that was developed by the environmental community. This was a term that recognized in the international mining industry that if mining companies go against the community and ignore those wishes for sustainable development and for self-determination, those projects will not be economically successful. And therefore, mining companies had to get not only the consent of the tribal community, but of the surrounding community as well. That is what is meant by a social license to operate. And in the absence of a social license, the risk of those investments go up astronomically. So those were two major achievements which essentially reconfigured the entire power relationship between resource-rich communities and multinational mining and oil corporations.
I would add that it doesn't just stop with extractive industries either. We're seeing a lot of issues in the Northeast with these huge wind projects being fast-tracked right over tribal consultative processes. So that has the potential to disturb and destroy cultural resources that are now under the ocean, who are well within the homelands of those people, and disrupt migratory patterns of marine mammals. And it's not okay to do that in the name of fast-tracking even non-extractive energy development projects. So I just want to say that environmental justice and following trust and treaty obligations doesn't stop with in the name of green development either. And then the other thing that came to mind when you were talking was that, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. It'll come back.
Well, I just wanted to give anybody an opportunity if they want to come up and ask a question, introduce yourself, and then you can ask your question. And in the meantime, we do have some audience questions. The first one is, what is the conversation like between indigenous farming and agriculture and dairy farming in Wisconsin?
I thought of my other idea.
Oh,
So the idea was that there is the treatment as a state option for tribes to develop their own clean water standards, and that is an exercise of sovereign authority. And that is extending into other areas and agencies now. So a lot of what you'll hear from tribal governments and organizations is the right to contract these services to our own people directly and not have to go through all of this red tape and follow all of these regulations that don't make any sense. So in the Farm Bill, for example, we're talking about not just 638 contracting, but being able to compact and bring that authority in-house. Because what's essentially happened, I don't know if you all saw Killers of the Flower Moon. What stood out to me about that movie, and I don't think they did a good enough job on this, is that she has to go and declare herself incompetent and ask for her own money. And that still happens with our lands. When our lands are in trust, we have to ask for the permission to do stuff with them. And then we have to wait for a grant to come through to do that thing that we want to do. What the heck is that? So when we say that we are ready to contract and we're ready to compact these responsibilities, we really mean it. And if you say you're an ally, I don't want to see you at those tribal consultations and at the Senate Ag Committee getting up there and saying tribes aren't ready and tribes don't have the capacity to do that, because we absolutely do. That's all I had to say.
Thanks for that. So again, if anybody wants to come ask a question, feel free to come up to the microphone. And then you can also fill out our note cards and ask your question as well. But
I just had a quick comment on
Go for
the relationship between sovereign tribal nations and dairy farmers in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
The closest the tie that I really see that's critical is that a lot of some tribal nations in Wisconsin, they rent out a remarkable amount of their land. They have tribal farms, farm it themselves, but they do rent out land. And there's been a movement across the country to take, and it's really been led by the Oneida Nation. There's a lot of dairy farmers that rent from the Oneida Nation, dairy farmers that rent from Ho-Chunk Nation. But the increasingly tribal nations are making some pretty hard asks within that lease agreement to be able to have absolutely amazing standards for conservation. As a part of that agreement, you get to rent the land, but these things have to happen out there, and we're going to require documentation on it. So I think there's probably some additional benefits to that as well, because when the dairy farmer is being held to that higher standard, they may just recognize the inherent value of that and recognize it as something they need to incorporate into the rest of their operation. But that's as close as I can come. Thanks.
So we have a lot of issues here with runoff into our creeks.
Chris, those are you said really high asks that they give for the renting dairy farmers?
It's in this rental environment. Anyway, I'm sorry.
But those are asks that the tribes themselves do meet.
Yes.
Themselves, correct?
Probably there's a higher level on of the.
I mean, they're not asking something that they don't meet themselves.
No, that's actually it's. They're not asking the level. I shouldn't opine on this, but there's a higher level of land stewardship on the lands that they're farming themselves.
Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say that, so all growing up here in Oneida, we have a lot of creeks, and there used to be fish that would live in those creeks that people would actually eat. And since I've been alive, I have not seen any living fish in those creeks. But just this past year, because of the efforts of the tribe to create buffer zones for those creeks to keep the manure out of them, we did have trout spawn in the creeks. So that's landscape conservation, right? Landscape level, not piecemeal, but thinking about the landscape as a whole, right? So I think that we all stand to benefit from following these land stewardship practices and following these approaches, because the way we think about it, it's not just about the food that you're growing on the land, on the little parcel that you can draw it on a map. It's connected to this whole web and this whole ecosystem that interacts with each other. And so if we can drive that home, or at least regulate it to the point that it has to be followed, then we all stand to benefit from there being fish. There should be fish in the creeks, right? Like we agree that there should be fish in water, that's where they live. So I think that there's a lot of changes that we could see, a lot of positive changes at the landscape level when tribes have that regulatory authority of the land and can make those changes. So I think those relationships, even though they're not always super smooth and super friendly all the time, they do have benefits that are not just for this generation either, they're for future generations.
Thanks for that. Do you have a-
So I'm Haley. I go to St. Norbert College. I just wanted to know, in what ways have Indigenous peoples had to adapt to climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the Intergovernmental panel on climate change released a report in 2016 saying that Indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And we can see that happening today. And in I think this same year, actually, that report came out, and the Bad River tribe experienced like massive flooding that completely like ruined the roads, which is like to and from the reservation basically, which prevented a lot of people from getting their dialysis treatments or just access to larger grocery stores. So we're seeing that today. But not only are we the most going to experience most vulnerable to that. We're also the most resilient. 'Cause we've seen climate change. We've seen the effects of it a lot. One thing we were just talking about is how the winter is really weird right now, and that's causing some issues with our sugar maple trees. The one who gave us his gift of offering maple sap for us to make into syrup and sugar. One thing that we're seeing is that this is such a weird winter and spring. I don't even know what season it is right now. Actually, is it fall? Is it summer? I don't know. But our adaptation to this, I would say adaptation or just protection, is some of us are deciding not to harvest maple sap this year, and climate change is presenting itself through the seasonal changes, and our adaptation or our way to adapt to climate change and these changes is to rest, is to let these trees rest and take a step back for a second, and that's our way of adapting.
So I'm not going to start with 10,000 years ago, but I think that just for our corn co-op planting corn, our first year as a co-op was 2016. It was a kind of a weird year. Then we had some flooding years, then we had some drought years. The really weird thing is that it's really hard to tell when to plant because our phenological signals to plant don't line up with when the soil is ready to plant anymore. And so trying to follow our traditional way of doing things is becoming more challenging because things are tipping out of control. And so we have our instructions on how to prepare for this time, and we're trying to uphold those responsibilities to each other to do that. And so I really, when we kind of talk about like what could we possibly do, we have everything we need right now to fix this problem. This is not a technological problem. This is a problem of values and a problem of willpower, a problem of community, and a problem of the power of the people being able to decide what happens next. So we think about that with our processes. We think about what if this decision that we make today, how is this going to impact the next 7 generations? Are they going to be able to eat this corn here in this place on the Oneida Reservation? Or is there going to be maple trees in Wisconsin in 100 years? We think about those things. So I think that one of the things that we're doing is the cover cropping, and that has a lot to do with building the soil back up so that we're not just taking care of the corn, and we're not just treating the soil like a dead media that anything can throw enough fertilizer on there, anything will grow. We're taking care of the community that lives in the soil. We're taking care of all of those bacteria, insects, all of those, the birds then that, feed on those, that whole web, right? And that makes us more resilient, because if we do have a dry year, there will be enough water stored in the soil for the corn. If we have a flooding year, the water will infiltrate instead of hitting our hard, deadpan soil, like you see those just really sad fields with the just completely bare soil, and carry all the soil right into the creek and then create a dead zone eventually in the Mississippi, the end of the Mississippi and the Gulf. So that's one of the things that we do. The other thing that we do is we grow a lot of different kinds of foods. And we do that because it's delicious, but we also do it because it's resilient. It's resilient to have biodiversity. A field of one monocrop of one kind of species is a really fragile system. And I hope that we can save these heirloom seeds because they have all of the different traits and all of the different memories and all of those different teachings that we need to survive into the future. So we're really focused on not abandoning those seeds and those relatives for the latest technology and the latest fix to climate change, but how do we adapt technology available to us to make sure that they are still here with us into the future?
Hi. My name is Sophie Buchholz. I'm a master's student. I'm from De Pere originally, but I'm up in Canada doing research very similar to this. I right? Resilience and adaptive capacity so many times a day, it just makes my head spin. But yeah, and obviously the discourse is very different. I work up in the subarctic region, and my research is on sea ice degradation and how that's impacting communities up there, very visceral. And so one thing I want to ask, a lot of things that came up in my personal research were conversations about intergenerational knowledge transfer. And so I'm really interested in that, and also how climate change, the words climate change are such a touchy subject. A lot of people hate hearing those words, and aren't receptive when you start talking about climate change. But when you talk about changes in seasons and changes in phenology and things, oh, look at the weather. Everybody can agree about the weather. So I'd love to hear from all of your perspectives as climate change has become more prominent in recent years, but just how that manifests itself and how intergenerationally, how that works in the knowledge transfer of these changes.
Yeah, that's a interesting question, and thank you for that. And your research sounds really cool. Intergenerational learning and knowledge transfer, at least for the Ojibwe people, has happened through oral knowledge and storytelling, and that has been seen, and that knowledge has been preserved through that transfer for hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and it's important to note that traditional ecological knowledge, traditional is kind of a tough word because it sounds like it's old, it's static, it's unable to be changed. But I don't think that's true, because when we talk about these phenological changes, I was discussing this during another presentation where I was talking about that there is TEK that I've heard from my elders about the time that walleyes are spawning and ready to be speared and ready to be harvested, is when the spring peepers come out, when you start to hear the spring peepers. And that is just like so cool. That TEK tells us that, I don't know what triggers spring peepers to come out, but when they're coming out for whatever climactic reason, that the water temperature is the right temp for the walleyes to come in and be ready to spawn. So I think that's so crazy, that connection and that knowledge that's held, and just that interrelationships of species. But obviously that's changing now. I don't see that happening anymore as I go out to harvest walleye. But I was talking about that during a presentation, and then this one non-native person was like, well, what are the new indicators? And like, oh yeah, what are they? And it's kind of like this traditional ecological knowledge is going to change and adapt to changes in seasonality, and that'll be a story we tell eventually. Maybe there's a new indicator that I will transfer to my future generations, and so TEK can adapt. Obviously, there's knowledge that needs to be protected, and we can't lose this, but we're adaptive and we're resilient. Hope that answers some of that.
Yeah, we have that built into our group because we have all kinds of great-grandparents all the way down to great-grandbabies. And so there's all kinds of knowledge transfer between generations, and it's really important to us that everybody feels included in everything that we do, because it's really weird to have all the generations completely separated, and it creates a lot of loneliness and other really negative impacts. So that's one of the things that we try to uphold in that teaching, because we really think that everybody has a talent, a gift to offer the village, right? And everybody has a piece of that original traditional ecological knowledge that was, I mean, at one point just who we were. We didn't have to name it as a separate thing. That was just our identity, was having all of that knowledge. And then through the process of colonization and assimilation, that got broken into all of these different pieces. People got scattered, knowledge got scattered. But all of those pieces are still with us, and so we have to bring those together to put that back together as one thing. And so we really try to honor that each person is bringing a part of that knowledge into the group, and that that intergenerational sharing, that's part of the healing of growing the food. Growing the food is like a nice outcome of everything that we do. What underlies all of that is those practices and that practical knowledge, and then what's underneath that is the value system, the philosophy, the stories that connect all of us. So it's absolutely crucial to have that intergenerational connection.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. We've just got time for one more audience question, so I've got one here. This is for Leah. You said not all information is meant for everyone. This person writes, I neither disagree nor challenge that statement, but I want to more fully understand it. Could you say more about that?
So sometimes you might know something about someone you really care about or a precious place, and you might really understand that that information is secret and needs to be protected in a special way. And so one of the things that we talked about was, if you look at broadly, data sovereignty and the idea of creating these GIS projects to map out all of these resources sounds really fun and cool until everyone knows where your old birch trees are and they want to go cut them down. Or everybody knows where you're gathering medicines, and they think they're weeds and that they should go, you know what I mean? And so there is certain knowledge that is meant to be in the hands of those that will surely protect what the knowledge is about. And then there is certain knowledge that is like, yes, we should all be thankful. That's for everybody.
Thank you. And just in closing, wanted to get all of your thoughts. I know that sometimes when we talk about climate change, and as a reporter who reports on climate change, I know that it can feel pretty doom and gloom out there. And there's certainly so many challenges to contend with, but I do like to try to end on a little bit more of a positive note. So I'm curious if you all would talk just briefly about, what makes you hopeful right now, and what solutions that you've either yourself implemented or witnessed inspire you.
I think events like these make me hopeful. Seeing more desire and wants and the recognition that traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledges are needed in the climate change discussion and space. That makes me hopeful that people are finally listening. There should be more people listening. Sometimes people don't listen to me, but they should at some point. So I think that makes me hopeful. Makes me hopeful that people reach out to me and ask respectfully, how do I do this? How do I engage with the tribes? Because they know that they should and that they need to, but sometimes they just don't know how, and that's a scary thing. You don't wanna mess things up or have some unintended consequences of your engagement with tribal communities. So it's scary, but it's important to go through that uncomfortability and be okay with feeling nervous or scared and ask questions respectfully with good intentions and don't be extractive. People will reach out to me and ask, like, how do we effectively and respectfully reach out to these tribal communities? How do we engage with them? And it makes me hopeful to be able to collaborate with them and work on that with them and make it good all the way around and a reciprocal relationship with the tribal communities.
We just completed that cover cropping project. That went really awesomely. We partnered with UW Extension. We got a sustainable agriculture research and education grant. We spent 3 years with them. Really, Ohilagu was the central applicant, and they were a partner on the project. They were an excellent partner on the project. I think maybe one of the few great examples of a university truly taking the back seat and offering resources and not asking for anything in return, even the data that we produced. So that was pretty cool. And so over those 3 years in our group setting, we have a lot of different ages in our group, a lot of families. And so there's, some pouty teenagers that probably would rather be playing video games that come out to the barn. And you really aren't sure if they're listening, if they're paying attention, if they're learning anything. But then they turn around and they say, oh, I don't want to be part of my family's membership anymore. I want to be my own member this year. I want to be responsible for my own hours to the cooperative. Or I want to write this essay about everything that I learned as part of this. And you're like, dang, I thought they were just in the corner pouting this whole time, and now I'm going to cry about it. So that's what gives me hope, is that, we get all of these messages about how lost the youth are, but I think they really are listening, and they really do want to be involved, and we're really seeing that.
When it comes to positivity, I have a lot more positivity about climate change adaptation and the expertise that tribal nations and tribal staff bring to that. I'm a little bit less optimistic on the climate change mitigation. I mean, changing that bad-looking curve. I just wanted to express that we have a great appreciation for the subject matter expertise that resides within the tribal nations. We're honored to have a representative on the climate change adaptation menu cohort. And if you're looking to get some type of perspective as a non-tribal member regarding how tribal nations, more on the Ojibwe side, view climate change and climate change adaptation, it's very interesting read, particularly for people that do not have tribal affiliation. And going back to Leah's point on some of it's none of my business, and a bunch of it's none of my business when it comes to traditional ecological knowledge. We're trying to get better as a federal government. We're trying to get better at working on a government-to-government relationship with tribal leaders and tribal department staff, and trying to get better at deferring to your better judgment, because we don't need to know everything. But if we have the right relationship, we can defer to your better judgment in order to have that knowledge affect the outcomes. So.
I would say one of the most optimistic lessons that I've seen in the last decade was the resistance at Standing Rock. And the bringing together of indigenous people, not just from the directly affected tribes, but from all the tribes in the United States, as well as abroad, as far away as Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, who recognized in the struggle of the Dakota people opposed to the Dakota Access Pipeline, that what was being challenged was the untrammeled authority of the fossil fuel industry to run over the indigenous populations of the world, whether it be at Standing Rock or in the rainforests of Brazil, where you now have a government in Brazil that has pledged to recognize the rights of indigenous people to demarcate territories of indigenous control. And when those territories are recognized as legally binding agreements between the government of Brazil and those indigenous peoples, what you have is a dramatic reduction in the deforestation of the Amazon. And one of the major sources of the exacerbation of greenhouse gases is the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So to the extent that you have indigenous populations that are gaining increasing ability to control their own environment and reduce the deforestation, in the last couple of years since the election of a Democratic government in Brazil, the deforestation rate has been cut in half from the previous administration of Jair Bolsonaro, who was known as the Trump of the tropics. These are the reasons why the struggles of indigenous peoples, not only here in the States, but around the world, are making the most significant strides in reducing the dangers of the expansion of a fossil fuel industry, which is destroying the planet and destroying life on the planet.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before we move into, I think, another round of thank yous, there's one person that Caitlin couldn't thank before, and that's Caitlin. So I just wanted to say thanks to Caitlin for moderating tonight and also just being a great leader on this project. I know Frank and I really appreciate the leadership that you have given, and we're really grateful for that. So just quick round of applause for Caitlin, if y'all don't mind. And now I'll turn it back.
So again, we just want to thank everyone who helped make this series and the community event possible. Can we give a round of applause for our panelists, please? And again, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. We are all better off for it, and we're really grateful for your time. We also want to thank all of you for attending, and we hope you carry on these conversations well after this event. And again, we want to thank our sources on the story, our funding sources as well, the Poynter Institute and the Joyce Foundation, the Oneida Hotel, and also our live stream team through USA Today Network Wisconsin. And before we go, we have a QR code up here. That will send you to a link tree that has the links to our stories, as well as a survey where you can tell us what you thought about the event, what you liked, what you didn't like. And also there's an opportunity there for you to tell us reporters what other stories you would like to hear on this topic. So again, thank you so much for your time and for coming this evening.